Yesterday, I had really the great privilege and honor of having been invited into the archives of the Dukes of Medina Sidonia. And although we talk about this subject in some depth in our series Atlantica, it's a subject that is so important and it's so profoundly historical that it deserves a little bit of its own backstory, which is what I'm doing this for, really. And in the case of the family, the Dukes of Medina Sidonia, they're a very well-known name, one of the oldest aristocratic families in Spain. But there are many people outside of Spain that don't know who they are or who they were. And their history is so rich and so deep, and their archives are so important and completely off limits to the general public. People often talk about the archives at the Vatican. We're talking about that level of importance. So this, for me, yesterday was a 7-year-long dream to be able to be given access to these archives. And thanks to the friends that I have who at the Palace of Medina Sidonia, here in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, who invited me to access these archives. I'm so grateful, and it was and will be forever one of the highlights of my investigations here into the work that we're doing, into the prehistory of this area. And in order to really get into this, I have to step back in time and explain to the viewers, to you, what this means, what this is all about. And it begins in the 13th century with Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, also known as El Bueno, the Good. And the reason he's known as the Good, we'll get into in just a minute, but the history behind the beginning of this incredible monastic family, one of the oldest monastic families in all of Europe, begins in the 13th century. And just to give people a little bit of a backdrop on this time period in Iberia being Spain and Portugal. This is the Iberian Peninsula. It's a huge piece of land. Also, I must add one little detail: peninsula in Greek, gnosos, not only means island, it also means peninsula. That's something that I'll be referring back to later. But at the time, Spain was going through an incredible transition and shift. A few centuries earlier, the Muslims, the Moors, had invaded Iberia. The Arab world often refers to this time period as their golden age. But there's something that many people neglect to talk about, which is very important. It might well have been their golden age, but when the Moors arrived in Iberia, Iberia was suffering through different conflicts, political conflicts, and transitions. So when the Moors arrived, it wasn't as if they arrived in some place that had no history whatsoever, a deserted land. To the contrary, they arrived in a land that was steeped in tradition and rich in history, dating back to prehistoric times. This is one of the oldest human settlements or settled areas known on the entire planet. We'll get into that in a minute as well. Now, let's get back to Guzmán el Bueno, the first count or duke, of Medina Sidonia. Medina Sidonia also, I'd like to get into the name of what is Medina Sidonia. Why is it called Medina Sidonia? That's a fascinating story as well. And I also want to transition into how that relates to our work on Atlantis, a prehistoric civilization in this area, and how it relates to Plato's incredible texts on Atlantis, the Timaeus and the Critias. So let's begin a little bit here with Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, El Bueno. The story is incredible. He was responsible for the expulsion, or the beginning really of the expulsion of, not the beginning, it was a centuries-long problem. When the Moors conquered this area, they were able to do so in great part due to the various conflicts that were happening through different political powers in Europe at the time, and which worked out very well for them. And it got to the point where the Christian leaders at the time were realizing that this was going to be inevitably a problem, because it sort of reflects a little bit of, I won't get into politics at this point, but it reflects a little bit of some of the issues perhaps going on in the world right now, especially in Europe. But at this point, the Christian powers that be in Europe were realizing that there was an issue here, and that there needed to be a reconquista, a reconquest of their territories, of these lands. And at the time, and just to give people sort of a geographical idea for people who don't know Iberia, this part of Spain, the region, the province within which I live, and the province which was dominated by this ancient monastic family, aristocratic family of the Dukes of Medina Sidonia, they controlled the province of Gades, the current province of Gades, known and described by Plato in his texts as the region of Gades. So, dating back to before the Copper Age, this was known as Gades, and it's still known as Cadiz. And it all ties into this incredible story and the incredible privilege that I had to visiting these archives, and what I was able to learn there, and the maps I saw. We're going to be talking about all these different subjects right now. So it starts with Guzmán el Bueno. At the time, his palace was in the city of Tarifa, which is just down the coast from us. Today it's very well known for surfing and kite surfing and being the windiest city in Spain. It's only about an hour away from where I live. It's just before Gibraltar. And he had his palace there. It was the 13th century, and there was this conflict, and the city they were trying to maintain power in the city of Tarifa. And when the Moors essentially showed up at his palace with his son holding a knife up to his throat, and they were shouting out to the palace, "Give us control of the palace, or we're going to kill your son." And in an act which is almost incomprehensible for anybody that has a kid today or has children today, he took his own knife, his own dagger, and tossed the dagger over to them and said, "Use my own knife." And we have to understand something. That might sound, and it does sound, and it is incredibly, almost incomprehensible to anybody to understand how you could do that to your own son, which effectively they took the knife and killed him. But at the time, we have to understand that it was an act of it's hard to describe the words, courage and chivalry in a sense, because he recognized that it was either going to be one person, albeit his son, or the fate of an entire nation. In hearing this, the King of Spain rewarded Guzman with a title, a noble title, and also gave Guzman El Bueno, Alonso, the deeds to a massive, and the control to massive amounts of land, which in today's terminology would result in almost a kingdom of its own, including the rights of fishing for the tuna all along this coast. Now, that might sound, for somebody who knows nothing about fishing, that might sound like something a little bit bizarre, but even today, the greatest tunas that we eat when we're eating sushi from Japan, most of those tuna come from here. So it's no joke. This is he had been given an incredible lineage of legacy of land and territory and honor and power, a great deal of power. And his line of his dynasty still exists today. People with whom I'm blessed to be friends with, and whom invited me into the archives yesterday. So let's fast forward. The expulsion of the Muslims from Iberia took a few hundred years, with the last territory having been Granada, which coincided also, this is all tied into this incredible history that a lot of people don't even know about. Excuse me, which resulted, actually the same year as the fall of Granada, or the Reconquista de Granada, which was the last Muslim territory, was also 1492, was coinciding with Isabella and Columbus conquering the New World. And this is where I'm going with this. This is why this is so exciting. It's really something, and this is what the secrets that are embedded and integral to these archives that are, like I said earlier, if anybody's heard of people talk about the archives at the Vatican, we're talking about strategically something as important. Now, just to give everybody a little bit of a geographic idea, a lot of people don't know the geography of this area. Sanlúcar de Barrameda sits, and Chipiona and Huelva are all in the province of this province of Gades. Sanlúcar sits at the entrance of the river Guadalquivir. Now, Guadalquivir is an Arab word. It was two words. Quivir means large. Guadal means river. So it's the large river, which in prehistory wasn't actually a river at all. It was the entrance to this inland sea, which even until Roman times was referred to as Lagus Ligustinus. It later became a swampland, and it now has become one of the most important national parks in Europe, and one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. And so up until Roman times, it was a navigable inland sea, which slowly over time filled in, and it still gets flooded. And I've actually gone and filmed there hundreds of times. It's been a wonderful pleasure and honor. But there's certain times during the year when you see when it's still flooded and you realize, darn man, this was even not that long, even up until today, it's somewhat of an inland sea. But predating the Romans, in prehistoric and Tartessian times, it was referred to as the Golfo Tartessico, the Tartessian Sea. It was even larger, and its waters extended past the modern city of Sevilla. All of these things are very important. Now, in the 1500s and the 1400s, during the conquista of the New World, this is the area that Columbus and the Pinzon brothers, a lot of people don't know this history, but we're going to be talking about this. The Pinzon brothers were really the ones responsible for getting Columbus to America. A lot of people always refer to Columbus as being the one who managed to pull this off, but it was the Pinzon brothers who really managed to accomplish that. And where were they from? They were from here. So, going back to Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Sanlúcar de Barrameda and Chipiona and Huelva formed the entrances through the rivers, and most importantly, the river Guadalquivir, the large river. They formed the riverway which led its way up to Sevilla. So Sanlúcar de Barrameda and Sevilla were essentially two powerhouses in terms of colonial superpowers, should we say. And that's why their archives hold so many incredible pieces of information, maps, and historical references to all sorts of elements which we're discussing here. So let's get back to Columbus for a second. Guzmán el Bueno, first in the line of this incredible monastic family which survives till today. And just to give you an idea, they were so powerful and so wealthy that they rivaled or exceeded the wealth of the King of Spain himself. They controlled the waterways. And remember, this area sits at the very entrance of the Straits of Gibraltar, formerly known as the Straits of Heracles, the most powerful, arguably the most powerful people in the world at the time, because the Mediterranean was one, if not the most desirable place in the world for humans to live. It remains one of the most ideal places for humans to survive and to thrive in the world, climactically and in terms of agriculture and land. And if you controlled the entrance of the Mediterranean, you were extraordinarily wealthy, extraordinarily important. In prehistoric and mythological terms, you could say you were a god. That's where these histories and these mythologies of Poseidon and Zeus, they all ruled over these lands. So the river Guadalquivir was the first line. It sits in just outside of the Straits, outside of the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic. It is at the entrance of the river Guadalquivir, which leads up to Sevilla. So it was the place where ships, galleons, armadas could enter in from the actual ocean itself into the land, and therefore distribute the wealth of goods that came from their ships throughout the entire known world at the time into the empire, into the Iberian Peninsula. So why is that important? And also another thing which I have to mention is Alonso Guzmán el Bueno was the first in the line of these Dukes of Medina Sidonia, and later on, one of his descendants was in fact the admiral of the Spanish Armada, which of course was the most important armada in history. Everybody knows that story is actually another story for itself. They lost at that point to the English through a whole series of strategies. However, the family remained, and the family continued, and their archives still exist. And yesterday I was able to look at some of these ancient maps and documents and really fully understand the importance of certain secrets and certain highlights that people today don't have any idea about. The last Duchess of Medina Sidonia, who sadly I had no chance to meet. She passed away in 2008. Was a historian, and she grew up with these archives. She managed these archives. She was the person responsible for transferring all of these archives, cataloging them from Madrid in the 20th century to the Palace of Medina Sidonia. And she wrote over 300 books, many of which were historical books, in which she states clearly that Columbus was not the first person to cross the Atlantic. We know that now. We know that the Vikings were there, but that's a separate story. What we know, what I've learned, and we talk about this in the series in detail, but what we've learned about how Columbus was actually able to make that crossing with the help of the Pinzon brothers is a story that many people have no idea about. They have no idea how it happened. And part of the secret, we have to take into consideration that in today's high-tech world of secret knowledge, we have governments, we have espionage, we have technologies that other people don't have access to. Well, in that period, the technologies that people had little access to and were well-guarded technologies were maps. Maps were, throughout history, were extremely sought after. They were extremely sought after. They're extremely rare in their information. So if you were a superpower, you would have had a library of maps that no one else had. So why is this important, and why do the archives present information that show proof of pre-Columbian travel to the Americas? It's a series of pieces of information that show that this was a fact. The elements within the archives and the elements within this incredible family lineage and their information shows that Columbus and the Pinzon brothers knew certain things that other people did not know. One of those things is, how did Columbus know how to get to the Americas? And for people that don't know the geography all that well, the route that they would take would be from Spain, from the province where we live. They would travel past the Canary Islands to the Americas. On the return trip, they would pass through or past the Azore Islands to Iberia, back to Spain. Why is that? There's a very specific reason to it. They knew that there were underwater currents, still obviously exist, in the Atlantic Ocean. And those underwater currents pass past the Canary Islands that push boats towards the Americas, and the alternating currents to bring them back to the Iberian Peninsula run past the Azores Islands, right? So how did they know that? That's very privileged information, and it's not something you would come across by chance. The the last Duchess of Medina Sidonia, the Duquesa Roja, in one of her books, explains that fact. She explains that this was knowledge known before Columbus's time. Very important. So how far back was this knowledge known? Well, I believe it was known as far back as prehistoric times, and I certainly think it was known before Tartessian times. And many people, including myself, believe that the Tartessians are the very descendants of the Atlantean people, for good reason, for good measure, because of so many different facts that we cover, so many different facts that we cover in our series. So how do we know that Columbus wasn't the first? What I really believe from the investigations that we've been doing, I really believe this tremendously. We have to consider all of the political strategies that led to the conquest of the Americas. It's no coincidence that the conquest of the Americas occurred when it occurred. It was a strategically planned series of events. Another thing that we have to keep in mind, even though these lands, where we here in Spain, are rich with resources, gold was not one of them. So where did that gold come from? That gold that preceded Columbus and the Pinzon brothers reaching the Americas. Where did that gold come from? That's one little detail that's very important. I firmly believe that there was a political moment in this historical story when the timing was right, the political moment, the momentum was right, the knowledge was there. They knew about the Americas. That's being studied and has been studied and is being verified over and over again, not just because of the Vikings. Everybody knows about that. Also, there's stories of Roman triremes in South America. But we're starting to realize that these superpowers, these royal families, they knew this. They were privileged to this information. The momentum was right, and they said, let's do it. This is the moment to do it. Let's make the shocking announcement to the world that there's this grand continent across the Atlantic. Grand continent. Let's get back to the story of Plato's Timaeus and Critias, of Plato's Atlantis. A story which didn't begin with Plato. It began with Solon visiting the priests of Sais in Egypt. The priests of Sais who were the gatekeepers of the oldest knowledge of humankind, the halls of records. They were the people in charge with maintaining and guarding the oldest knowledge of our species, up to that point anyway. And in fact, we visited the very few remaining archaeological sites of Sais, which many people don't even know exist. And we recently visited that place, and it's a place where Solon had visited 2,500 years ago, and they told him the story about this ancient civilization that existed outside of the Straits of Heracles, in the region the Greeks knew as Gades. And the ancient priests of Sais, who are most probably related to the Coptic Christians of Egypt today, and who were related to the Greeks. A lot of people don't recognize that lineage, but they told Solon, they said to Solon, You Greeks don't realize we have the same ancestors that came from outside the Straits of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean, in the region known as Gades, Cadiz. And the Greeks had already colonized Cadiz at that point. The Greeks knew this area very well. They had cities here. The city of El Puerto de Santa Maria, which is right around the corner, 15 minutes from where I live, was originally named Portus Menisteus. I talk about that in the series. And they knew about this area. And in their description, and in Plato's description, he says the capital of this grand empire that ruled over the entire Mediterranean, but the focal point, the capital, was in the region known as Gades. And he says specifically in one truly important line, in the region of Gades, not as far as to cross the grand ocean, the Atlantic, not reaching the boundless continent, So Plato and Solon and Sais and the priests of Sais, they knew about the Americas. So this information that the Dukes of Medina Sidonia and the House of Medina Sidonia and their archives point, not just strongly, point definitively to this fact. I believe that that information was suppressed. I mean, if you have access to gold mines throughout South America and the Americas, you're hardly going to advertise it. And if you are powerful enough to have an incredible fleet of ships that is able to make that dangerous voyage, but is able to make it nonetheless, and return with gold, well, you're hardly going to advertise it. I think the advertisement was made when the time was right, and it was going to be, at some point, somebody was going to talk about it. The idea of maps is really important as well. I've talked about that a little bit earlier, but maps were so important. In fact, it was a story of a man who actually stole a very important map and was chased all throughout. I think he ended up in Portugal. Portugal and Spain have always had on and off. At one point, Portugal became part of Spain, and then they weren't friends, and they were friends, and so this man actually made his way to Portugal and established himself there, which in itself gives you a bit of an understanding of how South America was divided. Well, now it's Brazil was the Portuguese part, but was divided amongst these superpowers. But the majority ended up being in Spanish hands, and it all boils down to maps, to the knowledge of these ancient lands, and the ability to conquer them. There were also stories in the archives which I found very fascinating. They would actually fake maps. They would make false maps to throw people off, to throw competitors off. They would actually create false maps, which I find very funny. I mean, it sort of it makes me think of, imagine today somebody creating a fake program, a fake GPS to make you think something's there and it's not. To some degree, the current map of the world, as we know, is not accurate. It's a sphere. The world is a sphere, so we have to unwrap it in order to kind of map it on a flat surface. But the problem therein is that it shows certain continents and certain lands and territories as being very different in actual size than what they actually really are in size, and so that still is misleading. But imagine actually providing somebody in the ancient world, in the 1500s with completely erroneous maps, it would be a bit of a bummer for the person receiving that map. So, getting back to the Dukes of Medina Sidonia, I'd also like to talk about them for a second, because the province of Cadiz, as I mentioned earlier, the Alonso Guzman el Bueno, who was the first really in the line of this aristocratic, powerful family, began with his headquarters in Tarifa, which again is right at the entrance of the Straits of Heracles. It's not a coincidence. The same exact place which, according to mythology, Poseidon himself and his sons Atlas and Gaderus were ruled over. So they ruled over, in mythology, which there's always, as they say, some truth in mythology, they ruled over the Straits of Heracles. And then thousands of years pass. The Tartessians, known for their wealth and navigation and commerce and trade and mythologies, also ruled over this area. Then thousands of years later, the Phoenicians, who were closely tied in, obviously, with the Greeks, ruled or conquered this area. Then later, the Romans. People think of Rome as being the center of the Roman Empire, which it was, but the Roman Empire was not just Italy. Spain and Iberia, specifically this part, was their headquarters. There were 2 or 3 Roman emperors who were from here. So all these clues are highly important in the story, the narrative of the importance of this part of the world. And then, of course, thousands of years later, or a couple thousand years later, or not even 1,000 years later, you have the dynasty and the beginning of the Iberian Empire, and the Dukes of Medina Sidonia controlling this area, and resulting in these archives that I was able to visit, that are so secretly guarded and so importantly rich with all of this information. It's a story that needs to be understood, needs to be told. Let's talk a minute about this period of time. If we go back 1,000, 2,000 years, let's go back even further. Let's go back to Tartessian times, which are prehistoric times. The famous historian Strabo visited this area, and he wrote a series of texts talking about his encounters with the Turdetanos, who were the final stage of the Tartessian people. The last Turdetano king was called Argantonio. One of the many deities that the Tartessians revered and worshipped was the goddess Astartel, also known as Isis. And Strabo writes a text, a very interesting text, which has been interpreted in different ways, saying effectively, the Tartessians are the most advanced tribe. Tribe at the time doesn't mean just a group of people hanging around a bonfire. It meant civilization. They're the most they're the most advanced tribe that I have come across in Iberia. They have written laws dating back. Now he's writing this 2,500 years ago, and he says they have written laws dating back 6,000 years. 6,000 years. plus 2,500, 8,500. It means that almost 9,000 years ago, the ancestors of these Tartessian people had not only writing, they had laws, which implies a civilized society. And if you have laws, if you have civilization, you have navigation, you have industrial mining, which we know they have they had through the mines of Rio Tinto, where they mined, amongst many different things, mountain copper, cobre de la montaña, often referred to as, potentially, oricalco, which is this mysterious mythological red material that they would coat their buildings in, and their cities and their temples shone with gold, orichalcum, ivory. That's another very important thing that they had here was, until prehistoric times, there was prehistoric trade in ivory. Plato talks about 3 or 4 specific animals that helped in the daily running, so to speak, of Atlantis. He talks about the horses. He talks about the bulls. He talks about elephants. And he also talks about the honey, the bees. All of these things have been proven to exist here. The horses and the bulls of this region are some, if not the oldest species of their kind in the entire world. And people say, well, there aren't any elephants in Iberia, but there sure were. And prehistoric studies of prehistoric ivory trade here have shown conclusively that there weren't only 2 types of elephant. There was also prehistoric trade in Asian elephant ivory, which indicates very clearly that in prehistoric times there was trade with the other side of the Mediterranean, with Asia. So why wouldn't there be with the Americas, right? So all of these incredible details and much more are stored within these archives. All of these details come together to show something which perhaps in today's world would be easier to describe to the public. We have the internet, we have podcasts, we have experts putting in their opinions left and right. But back then, the details of these events were written down now and again, here and there, centuries apart, millennia apart. And what we're doing now is we're able to take these pieces of information through archives such as these and other pieces of information. And by the way, there's an entire plethora of pieces of information, which I will talk about in another presentation, regarding many of these details that are known to exist in the Americas, that certainly predate Columbus and date back to prehistoric times, all coming together to add to this a profoundly important story of our past, of human past. There's an entire sequence of events in prehistory that talks about the migration of people, of groups of people. North Africa was not in any way like what it is today. Even 2,000 years ago, it was nothing like it is today. There were different groups of people that have since migrated or been overrun by different groups of people that have invaded and remained. And it's often considered that the Tartessian people here were pre-Celtic people. This was in a time, 8,000 years ago, there was no English Channel. England was connected to mainland Europe through the Dogger Bank and northern France and Spain. People then migrate. People think about the Celts today as being primarily in Scotland and Ireland, but their history is a very lost one, and it begins much farther south. It begins here, and it begins, strangely and interestingly, also in North Africa. The Berbers. We'll talk about that in another presentation. So these are just a few initial stages of what I've been learning in these incredible archives. I'm so excited to be able to talk about these and share this information with the world. And it's something, the archives are being digitally documented for posterity, for the future of our species, which is imperative. We have to. It's equivalent to the in many ways to the Library of Alexandria, to the Vatican archives, to all the ancient archives that have, in some cases, since been lost. The archives of the priests of Sais. We must share this information. The world has to see this information because it tells a story of our people that is so ancient. In many cases, scientists and anthropologists, archaeologists, paleontologists, they try to do their best, and many times they do their best, to try to create a story, a narrative, to describe our past, to describe or try to catalog or categorize human history. But in reality, many times they base their information on very little evidence. We have to remember that we're a funny little species. We tend to, at our best, we are wonderful. And at our worst, we're terrible. We go in and we destroy. And it's easier to destroy than it is to create. But it is much more important to create. And I hope that a future version of ourselves is or will do better at creating than at destroying. But the world also, nature itself, just the way that physics works and the way that nature reabsorbs itself, is we have to take that into account. Buildings collapse. The only reason the pyramids still exist is because they were built at such a scale that time itself has struggled to decay them. But anything smaller, I mean, we recycle stuff. People, they used to, now it's not allowed, but even up until the 18th century, people would come along, and even locally here, they would dismantle ancient ruins simply to build their houses with them. If you find a brick, you're going to recycle it. You're not going to try to cut out a new brick. And that's a shame in a way, because it strips away information that we could have learned something from. But it is through methods like this that we have the capacity to learn more about our past. And I believe that our past is so much richer than what we have been told, or not through, sometimes through a misguided, purposely misguided transliteration by certain gatekeepers, but many times just through a lack of knowledge. Information gets lost, burned, transitioned. There's certain groups of people that have come in and have no desire to revere or respect past civilizations, so they just destroy them. I think in many ways those are the worst of our species, and they do us no favors. But the best of our species are the ones who try to peer into the past in order to improve our future. So I'll leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed my little presentation here today. And I could go on for hours because there is so much to talk about here. But the next step, I think, will be to discuss not only the destruction that Plato describes that destroyed Atlantis, which includes all sorts of studies, the Younger Dryas period, cosmic impact events, but what that meant for the survival of our species and for where we are today.